Well, the work that I'm presenting this evening has to do with data that we gathered from last summer, about 6 weeks after they had finally capped the well. And basically what we were looking at, it was the level of contamination of petrochemicals in coastal species that are important for kind of commercial interest but also ecologically important species. The level of contamination that we found, specifically the PAHs that everybody was kind of talking about and looking for, were, at least our group found much higher levels of PAH contamination in the coastal species than some of the state and local agencies had found and reported. We weren't sampling in the same areas on the exact same days, and of course there might have been currents or a variety of different reasons as to why on one particular day you might have found different levels. But part of it too is that I'll be presenting tonight has to do with the way in which FDA kind of calculates what they call a level of concern, how high the threshold is of a particular toxin, and whether or not that's important enough to close the fishery. And so there's been some controversy about how those equations or how they calculate those levels. And so I want to present how even though the fisheries were opened early in August in Mississippi, that based upon an alternative way to calculate those things, that perhaps they should have left them closed. There's the potential that the contamination within the species or within the specimen was basically an edible organism. And so, if you're talking about a shrimp or an oyster or something like that folks would normally go out to a restaurant and eat, if the level of contamination was higher in those species, then the possibility is that people might have ingested a higher than indicated level of those PAHs, which is a health interest. It's a health issue. So this was last summer that we gathered this data, but it also begs kind of a question of understanding, okay, what was the true level of contamination for these organisms, and what does that mean going forward as far as, how is it going to affect those organisms' long-term survival, their success in the ecosystem, whether they're going to reproduce the next generation so that, shrimpers and oysters next year, actually have a crop to go out and harvest. And so all of those are questions that are still open, but are a little bit more concerning if you have a level of contamination in those species that was higher than people had thought. If you have toxins that are in the water at a higher concentration than what people originally thought, then the possibility is that the next generation of shrimp or the next generation of oysters, when they're in their microscopic larval stage, they're going to be really susceptible to those kind of toxins. So if you have those toxins in the water and those populations are decimated, the larvae, and then you open the fisheries and say, okay, everybody can come and harvest the adult breeding age population, then you have the recipe for kind of a really hard time for the fisheries to recover, because you have the next generation essentially died off potentially because of the oil that might have been in the water, and then the adult population that will basically repopulate those local populations. If they're all fished out, there's not going to be a whole lot of shrimp or oyster left to kind of repopulate the area. Human health at this point, it's difficult to say. I mean, the conventional wisdom is that there's nothing left to be measured out there. Essentially, what you have is a situation where obviously it's been a year. The materials that are out there get weathered fairly rapidly, and so I mean that makes sense that a lot of those toxins would have been either diluted or weathered to the point where they're no longer toxic. But you have to remember that, I mean, this was an unprecedented spill. I mean, the amount of oil that was put into the Gulf of Mexico was unlike anything we've ever seen. And by NOAA's own estimates, only about 25% of the crude was actually recovered or accounted for. So the 75% that's still out there, either evaporated or dispersed in the water or sank to the bottom, it's still there. I mean, I don't want to be alarmist, but I mean that's essentially what happened after the Valdez. Is that it took a couple years, but that fishery collapsed and it still hasn't recovered. And so that's my main concern, is that we're kind of on that same path, that we're thinking everything is fine, but it's going to take another year or two for this all to really shake out ecologically.